Hey everyone, I am so excited today because we are going to practice adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. Get pumped. Okay, yesterday we were adding and subtracting fractions with like denominators or common denominators. Today we are going to add or subtract with unlike denominators, which means we are going to have to make equivalent fractions. So these steps will help us walk through the homework. You can refer back to it at any point, and I'll go back to it too. But here we go, the directions. We have to find a common denominator, add or subtract the fraction, and simplify the answer, because we have to have our answer in the smallest version that it can be. And then, of course, check your work with a calculator to make sure you've got it. So looking at number 1, 4/10 plus 8/100. I know since I am adding fractions, my denominators have to be the same. 10 and 100 are not the same, so the pieces we're comparing aren't the same size. So I need to make an equivalent fraction by multiplying or dividing by one whole. I like to multiply, so I'm going to see if I can turn my smaller fraction, 10, into my bigger fraction, 100, and I can. If I take 4/10 and multiply by the whole, 10 over 10, I can get a denominator of 100. If I multiply my numerators, 4 times 10 equals 40. So I'm going to cross out 4/10 because I changed that to an equivalent fraction. And then I'm going to write my number sentence or my equation, 40 100ths plus, and this is going to stay the same because I didn't change it, 800ths equals, and then I know 40 plus 8 equals 48. And then since I'm adding, my denominators stay the same. It's 48/100ths. Now that's a big fraction, and I know that I like to have the smallest fraction possible. So I am going to divide. I know that 2 will work to divide by both because it ends in 8 and 0, and all multiples of 2 end in 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8. So if I divide by the whole, 2 over 2, to simplify, 2 times 24 equals 48, and 2 times 50 equals 100. So now I have the equivalent fraction 24/50ths. So it's smaller, but I know that I can get it even smaller because 24 ends in 4 and 50 ends in 0. So if I if I divide by 2 over 2 again, because those are both going to be multiples of 2, I would get 12/25ths. Now I have 12 in the numerator. That would work with 2. 25 would not work with 2 because it ends in a 5. So I'm kind of thinking this is my smallest fraction, but if I'm not totally sure, I can check it in my calculator, type in the fraction 12, numerator, 25, denominator, hit simplify, and 12/25 is what it's giving me back, so I know that that's my smallest answer, and my answer is 12/25ths. Number 2, 7/10 minus 56/100ths. Since I'm subtracting, I know my denominators have to be the same. I have 10 and 100. They're not the same, so I can look at my steps up here. The first thing I need to do is find a common denominator or a like denominator that will help us make an equivalent fraction. So an easy way to do that is if I can turn my smaller denominator into my bigger denominator, 10 into 100. And I know I can because 10 times 10 equals 100. So next, step 2, I can multiply by a whole to create an equivalent fraction. So 7/10 is the one I'm going to be changing. I'm going to multiply by some whole to get 100 in the denominator. So I need to think 10 times what gets me to 100? I know 10 times 10 equals 100. Since I'm multiplying by a whole, because that's how we make equivalent fractions, a 10 has to be on the top. Then I can multiply 7 times 10, and that gets me to 70. So now I have my equivalent fraction, but I still have to do step 3, add or subtract the numerators. And the denominators are going to stay the same since I'm adding or subtracting. So let me just rewrite this fraction to its equivalent, 70/100ths minus 56/100ths. And then I can do 70 minus 6. I can use mental math. I can use a calculator. I can do a quick little problem off to the side. But you're going to get an answer of 14, and your denominator stays the same because we're subtracting. So 14 hundredths. Now, I definitely know this ends in a 4, this ends in a 0, so they're both multiples of 2. So I know to simplify, I can divide by 2 over 2. And I know 2 times 7 equals 14, and 2 times 50 equals 100, so I get 7/50ths. If I'm not sure if that simplifies anymore, I can't think of 2 is not going to work for 7. I can't think of anything that would. So I'm just going to check with my calculator real quick. 7 numerator, 50 denominator, simplify, and I get 7/50ths. So I know that I'm good, and I can circle my answer. Number 3, 2/12 plus 4/6. So I am adding fractions, so my denominators have to be the same. I see I have 12 and 6. Those are not the same. The easiest thing I could do would be to turn the smaller denominator 6 into the bigger denominator 12. I know I can do that because 6 times 2 equals 12. So I'm going to change 4/6 here. I'm going to multiply by a whole to get a denominator of 12. I know 6 times 2 equals 12. To make equivalent fractions, I have to multiply by a whole. So I'm going to multiply by 2 over 2. 4 times 2 equals 8, and I get 8/12. So I can change 2/12 is going to stay the same because that's the denominator I changed into. 4/6 is going to change to 8/12, the equivalent fraction. Now I have the same denominator, 12 and 12, so I can figure out how many 12ths. 2 plus 8 equals 10, and my denominator is 12, 10/12. Once again, I know 2, both of these numbers are a multiple of 2, so I can divide by 2 over 2 and get 5/6. And that seems like the smallest simplified fraction to me because I don't think there's a number that I can divide both 5 and 6 and get a whole number. But just in case, to make sure, I can check by putting in the fraction 5/6, 5 numerator, 6 denominator, simplify, equals 5/6, same thing. So I know I've got my smallest final answer. Okay, number 4, 4/8 minus 1/4. I'm subtracting, so my denominators have to be the same. I have 8 and 4. They're not the same. I'm gonna have to make an equivalent fraction. The easiest way to do that is if I can take my smaller denominator and change it into my bigger denominator. And I know I can do that. 4 times 2 equals 8. So I'm gonna change this 1/4 by multiplying by a whole to get an 8 in the denominator. 4 times 2 equals 8. To make an equivalent fraction, I have to multiply by 1 whole. So a 2 has to go on the top. And 1 times 2 equals 2. And I get 2/8. So come down here and see what I need to change. 4/8 stays the same. I'm subtracting 2/8, the equivalent fraction to 1/4. My denominators are the same, 8 and 8, so I just subtract my numerators. 4 minus 2 equals 2. How many 8s? 2/8. I know I need to simplify this to get the smallest fraction I can, so I'm going to divide by a whole, 2 over 2, to get 1/4 as my final answer. I know because it's a unit fraction and I have a 1 on the top that answer is the most simplified answer I can get. Okay, we are on the back. We have 40 hundredths minus 3/10. Since I'm subtracting, I know that my denominators have to be the same. They're not. I have 110. So I need to change them to make an equivalent fraction, and then I can subtract. So I know I can turn the smaller denominator 10 into the bigger denominator 100 by multiplying by 10. So if I take 3/10 and I multiply by a whole, I can change my denominator to 100. I know 10 times 10 equals 100. I need to make an equivalent fraction. To do that, I multiply by a whole. So I'm going to multiply by 10 over 10. And 3 times 10 is 30. And I get 31 hundredths. So 41 hundredths isn't going to change. I'm going to rewrite here. 3/10 changed to 30 hundredths. I can subtract. 40 minus 30 equals 10. And then my denominator stays the same since I'm subtracting. 10 hundredths. So 10 over 100, I know that's not the most simplified answer. I could divide by 10 over 10 to get a simplified answer, an equivalent fraction of 1/10. Since I have a 1 in the numerator, I know that's a unit fraction and I can't simplify it anymore. Let's try number 6. I have 1/3 plus 3/9. I'm adding, so I know my denominators have to be the same. 3 and 9 are not the same, so I'm going to see if I can change my smaller fraction 3 into my bigger fraction 9, and I know I can. 3 times 3 equals 9. So if I take this fraction 1/3 and multiply it by a whole to get a denominator of 9, I know 3 times 3 equals line 9. To make an equivalent fraction, I have to multiply by a whole. So if there's a 3 in the denominator, there has to be a 3 in the numerator, and 1 times 3 equals 3. And I get an answer of 3/9. So 1/3 is what's changing. Now I have 3/9 plus 3/9. And I need to find out how many ninths. 3 plus 3 is 6. I'm adding, so my denominator stays the same. And I get 6/9. I need to see if I can make an equivalent fraction to simplify this. So I think if I divide by, I can't do 2 because 2 times something will get me to 6, but not to 9. But I know if I divide by the whole 3 over 3, 6 divided by 3 equals 2, and 9 divided by 3 equals 3 to get 2/3. I know 2/3 is the smallest I can get this fraction, but remember, if you need to double check in your calculator, type in 2 numerator, 3 denominator, simplify, 2/3 comes right back, so I know that's as small as I can go. I can circle it and be good. All right, number 7, 5/10 plus 38 hundredths. Since I'm adding, I know my denominators have to be the same, and they're not. I have 10 and 100. So I'm going to see if I can change the smaller denominator into the bigger denominator, and I know I can do 10 times 10 to get 100. So I'm going to make an equivalent fraction to 5/10. So 5/10 times a whole to get a denominator of 100. I know 10 times 10 equals 100. To multiply by a whole, I have to have the same number in my numerator and my denominator. Multiply the numerators. 5 times 10 equals 50, and I get 50 100ths. So 5/10 changes to 50 100ths. I'm going to add 38 100ths. You can do mental math, use your calculator, or do a problem off to the side, but 50 plus 38 equals 88 hundredths. This is a big fraction. I want to make it smaller. I know 88 ends in an 8, 100 ends in a 0. Those are both multiples of 2. So if I divide by the whole 2 over 2, 88 divided by 2 equals 44. 100 divided by 2 equals 50. Once again, I can see I have 4 and 0 at the end of those numbers in the ones place, both multiples of 2, so I can do it again. Multiply by 2 over 2 to get 22 over 25. I know I can't divide by 2 again because it will work for the numerator, but not for the denominator that ends in a 5. I can't think of any other numbers that I could use to simplify, so I'm going to pull out my calculator and double check and do 22 numerator, 25 denominator equals, oh, I get 22 out of 25, so that means I can't go any smaller, and that is my answer. All right, number 8, 3/7 minus 2/14. I'm subtracting, so my denominators have to be the same. 7 and 14 are not the same. So I'm going to see if I can turn my smaller denominator into my bigger denominator. And I can see that I can. 7 times 2 equals 14. So I'm going to take 3/7. I'm going to make an equivalent fraction by multiplying by a whole to get a denominator of 14. I know 7 times 2 equals 14, so I'm going to multiply by the whole 2 over 2. 3 times 2 equals 6, and I get 6/14. So I'm going to change 3/7 to 6/14, and I'm going to subtract 2/14. 6 minus 2 equals 4. My denominators stay the same when I'm subtracting, so it's 4/14. I know that I can divide to simplify this fraction by 2 over 2 and get 2/7. I can't divide by 2 over 2 again because 2 times something won't equal 7. So I'm going to check with my calculator. 2 numerator, 7 denominator, simplify, and it just says 2/7, so I know I've got the simplified answer, and I'm going to circle it. All right, last one. 1/2 minus 1/10. I am subtracting. When I subtract, my denominators have to be the same. I have 2 and I have 10. They're not the same, so I need to try to turn my smaller denominator into my bigger denominator. I know I can do 2 times 5 to get 10. So I'm going to change the fraction 1/2 to an equivalent fraction. I'll multiply by some whole to get a 10 in the denominator. I know 2 times 5 is 10, so I'll put a 5 in the numerator to make it 1 whole. And 1 times 5 is 5, and I get 5/10. So I'm going to change 1/2 to 5/10, and I'm going to subtract 1/10, and I get 4/10. I want to simplify my answer. I know 2 will work for 2 and 10, so I'll divide by the whole. 2 over 2, and I get 2/5. If I want to make sure I simplified all the way, in my calculator I type 2 numerator, 5 denominator, simplify, and it says 2/5, so I know I have simplified it all the way. There you go. Great job making those equivalent fractions to add and subtract those fractions. You did awesome. Time for a victory cheer. Ready? Here we go. Good job. See you later.